All right, can you all see that screen?
Yes.
Okay, what you're looking at obviously is a Canvas page, and um, we're gonna go over some terms here that you may be familiar with, you may not. Um, Nevertheless, we're gonna cover about 8 different terms today, and we'll start off with a review of the three types of or 3 classes of natural resources that we have discussed. I don't know, Jeffrey, you were there last week. You remember when we talked about renewable and non-renewable? Actually, you and I had a good discussion on this. Uh,
Right.
Renewable and non-renewable, and then do you recall the third type of resource that you may have read about in the Dasman reading?
I can't off the top of my head.
Well, I'd always learned just renewable and non-renewable resources. Those are pretty straightforward. Renewable resources being things like timber and soil, water. Um, uh, what else would we say? Wildlife resources, marine fishery or fisheries. Um, while non-renewable resources or fund resources, FUND, or finite resources are those which do not replicate within the span of a human lifetime or a few human lifetimes. So those are mostly mineral resources that we utilize just by extracting them, and then we use them, and they're no longer uh, useful. Now we can recycle, of course. So we recycle um, certain metals, aluminum, uh, steel, iron, um, a few others, but most of that recycling is, well, some of it's significant, but we do recycle plastics now, of course, but that's not really a natural resource. So um, there's one other type that Dasman points out, and that's a perpetual resource. So a perpetual resource is one that's just always available, and it's not necessarily renewable. It doesn't need to be renewed. So things like sunlight or um, solar energy, wind energy, tidal energy. What's another one? Hydroelectric, maybe
Yeah.
geothermal energy. At least within the span of human lifetimes, most geothermal sources are going to continue to work. So, but those, what's the problem with geothermal in the traditional sense, not the more sophisticated engineering sense? Geothermal use of geothermal energy for electricity generation, as they use in Iceland. Only a few places around the world have geothermal sources that can turn turbine blades and produce electricity. But we also have the use of geothermal um, water recirculation systems within individual, houses, dwellings, and buildings, and that can reduce energy usage by retaining heat, or retaining, you mostly retaining heat in through water systems. So it actually always used a leader in that development in engineering and architecture. Nevertheless, let's get on. So we've got perpetual, we've got renewable, and we've got non-renewable resources. You remember what I said about, of course, perpetual resources, we don't have to worry about running out, right? So, the wind resources are going to be around for a while. And the thing about wind, though, and solar is that there are certain geographical areas that are better suited for producing electricity or utilizing those perpetual resources for energy generation than others. So obviously geothermal is probably one of the most isolated ones in places like Iceland, and where else? I guess you could probably drill into Yellowstone and produce electricity in Yellowstone, but nobody really wants to do that, right? Not very many people. There is in Oklahoma, we generate a lot of electricity through wind power, and even within Oklahoma, the sites of wind power production follow areas that have more more constant winds than others. So you see more wind generation out in the western part of the state, southern part of the state, than you do in the eastern part of the state, which is obvious. And then of course with solar for electricity generation, not passive solar for just home heating, but solar for electricity generations tends to be isolated into certain parts of certain regions where you don't have cloudiness all the time, places like the Southwest of the United States, Arizona, Southern California. So we can rely on that a little bit more. But of course, that's cyclical, isn't it? So you can't generate electricity at night using solar. So we've got these perpetual versus non-renewable. So perpetual resources we don't have to worry about depleting, right? Non-renewable and renewable, on the other hand, most people, I tried to make the statement, most people tend to have the assumption that it's the non-renewable resources that are the ones that are most in danger of being lost. So, and I've made a statement that that's not really the case. In fact, from an economic point of view, you might say that demand creates supply when it comes to non-renewable resources. And we talked a little bit about some examples of that with oil and gas and directional drilling and hydraulic fracturing in recent 10 years. So we have changes in technology that open up the known reserves of these non-renewable resources. I'll give you another example of a non-renewable resource. I didn't talk about this last time, but a non-renewable resource like gold, right? Everybody's still interested in gold. I visited a historic gold mining site in Alaska, just north of Anchorage, a few years ago, and it's just a state park, and it was a real interesting place because they it was mostly around World War II, probably went back before that, but maybe the 1920s to about World War II, maybe to the 1950s. There was this particular mine that was producing gold, and any of you know how we're familiar with the gold rush in California, where people panned for gold. Basically, they were recovering gold that had been revealed and eroded from the Sierra Nevada in California, right? So the gold rush in California was initially placer mining, where people would go out and recover that stuff that was eroded. But of course, later on, the big capital came in, and the mining took a different tact. So if you're familiar with California's history, a lot of land was blasted away by water cannons to reveal gold that had been deposited in river valleys and stuff. So that was a terrible impact to the natural environment, searching for gold. But gold mines also, of course, or gold is also mined, and it's typically mined in very hard rock, typically granite. So granite mining is no small feat. And this mine in Alaska had a seam of gold that was known, and it was in a mountainside encased in granite. And of course, the amount of energy and the amount of work that it takes to get to that gold is going to affect the profit on producing that gold. So the mine is abandoned now, and it's a historic site, and nobody's mining for gold there anymore. However, that doesn't mean that the gold is out. The gold is not run out. What happened was, what do you suppose? This gold mine in Alaska, where solid granite was blasted away with dynamite in order to recover gold and then move it up through a very, very deep shaft, from a deep shaft. what happened to that? Why don't they mine gold anymore there? There is still gold in the mine. Because other mines opened up, particularly in South Africa and Botswana, gold mining sources of gold that were easier to access, and perhaps maybe labor was cheaper, and perhaps the technology when those mines were developed was superior to the technology that was in place in the Alaska mine. Essentially, the Alaska mine still has gold, but to get to it is simply economically not cost effective. So, however, someday it may be, all right? Someday that gold may be accessible once technology changes, okay? So, in other words, this applies to any mineral source, any non-renewable source for the most part. We know that there are certain reserves out there. Some are just not recoverable. We just can't get to them because of the expense of technology or just maybe the lack of technology. However, eventually we'll have the technology and the expense will be lower. So those sources of the resource, whatever it may be, perhaps it's uranium, perhaps it's gold, perhaps it's oil and gas, natural gas. Those sources are going to be accessible in the future when our technology gets there. Now, question is, what drives the technological development of processes or systems that can recover those natural resources?
Would you say the need?
How is the technology that we know or we expect to advance to recover things like oil and gas deposits that we cannot reach at this point? What drives the technology that will allow for those innovations? What drives the development of those innovations, I should say?
Profits.
Profits, at least in a capitalist system, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not the only system. There have been other systems that have been tried, right? Feudalism, communism, but capitalism seems to be the type of form of social organization or economic organization that provides for the greatest amount of innovation in the shortest amount of time. However, there's a catch, and that is that you've got to have the demand for the resource, and that means the resource must be scarce, which means if the resource is in demand and is scarce, you have a price, and with that price, you have the potential profitability. So we have this kind of double-edged sword of having the ability to access natural resources in the future. But probably the way that's going to happen is for those natural resources to be utilized and remain in demand so that the innovations can improve. Now, there is some good news, and that would be that we know that utilization of resources, accessing resources can be environmentally detrimental, right? Certainly burning coal, most people would argue that, we should probably get away from coal, or we should at least try to figure out how to make coal a cleaner source of fuel. But really the only way, at least in a capitalist system, that that's going to work is for us to use more coal and for people to be able to have the promise that their efforts to improve technology or innovate through engineering and science is that they need to have that ability to make a profit. They need to have the, that they need to have a risk that is offset by, you know, a potential payoff. So anyway, we're kind of getting a little deeper than I wanted to, but keep these things in mind when we're looking at renewable and non-renewable resources. I'm going to have you look at something, it's a video about a concept called peak oil. You ever heard of that? The concept of peak oil, that's P-E-A-K, like peak, all right? Peak oil. And I'm going to ask you to think about that. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have, in other words, I'm saying, and this is not anything new, that non-renewable resources, because if they're within a, you know, if they're utilized within a capitalist system where there's a price that is measuring the demand and a price that communicates the actual value of that good or that resource to those who are using it, then we have a system that is probably going to be generating more and more technology that will open up reserves for that resource. Now, eventually and hopefully, the resource will become, the resources demand and supply will, you know, can push the price up so that there is incentive for people to find replacements for that good or that service, okay? So innovations that replace existing technologies with something that's completely new and hopefully, like, you know, very clean, are going to come along as alternatives. So you can only really get those alternatives if you have a consistent you know, promise of profitability. All right, so switching over to renewable resources. My point the other day was renewable resources are by far at a much greater risk of being depleted than the non-renewable resources. Did I say it correctly? Renewable resources are at a greater risk of depletion than non-renewable resources. And this has to do largely because our renewable resources are life forms, you know. Certainly wildlife, fish, plants, trees, you know, are life forms. Soil, you can consider soil a life form, maybe not water, but you know, the fact that there's a regeneration process going on is something that gets in the way or can cause serious problems with our use of renewable resources. So this is also something we should always keep in mind. I'm looking out my my office window at my house. I'm on the second story, and I'm looking out at a very large, I think it's a red oak, maybe it's a pin oak, a really big oak tree that's about 50 years old. And across the way, there are a lot of other big oak trees in my neighborhood here. And those oak trees were planted, right? 120, 130 years ago, if you would have been standing in this very spot, you would probably see nothing but grassland and maybe a few cottonwoods and willow trees in the creek bottom. And I'm kind of in the creek bottom of Boomer Creek. But anyway, you would not see these big stately oak trees. You might see on the uplands, you might see blackjack and post oaks, but you wouldn't see these big massive trees out on the prairie. Over the last 130, 140, 150 years in Oklahoma, here in north central Oklahoma, we've experienced reforestation. Reforestation has been the norm, the rule in Oklahoma since European settlement. Europeans brought reforestation. They brought essentially they brought fire suppression, okay? Farmers brought fire suppression, and with fire suppression, you have the expansion of the eastern deciduous forest, or at least you have the expansion of species from the east. And of course, like in this neighborhood, you have people planting trees, and on campus, you have people planting trees. So reforestation. So I want you to keep in mind that when, when forests are cut, when forests are used, when timber is used, that's not the end game. In Oklahoma and many other parts of the United States, Southeast Oklahoma at least, the timber that is being used for paper pulp and maybe some lumber is actually kind of a long-term agricultural project. So you have trees that can be harvested, and then through clear cutting, timber can be replanted with seedlings, and those seedlings, at least in that example, in the southeast part of Oklahoma where we have loblolly pine, those pine trees can grow really quickly, and it's actually profitable to reharvest after just about a decade and a half or two. And that's because those trees grow so quickly. So keep in mind that deforestation happens, but there is deforestation is also working against reforestation. So we have if trees are being cut down for timber and then the area is being left alone, well, okay, you can have regeneration. It's going to take a while for a rainforest to regenerate, of course. But if you're replacing that forest land with a new land use, then we've got a serious problem. So we've got the continuation of deforestation as agriculture expands. So that's an example of maybe a renewable resource that is being depleted, and it's intentionally being depleted for whatever reason. Then we have examples of shorter term renewable resources that can be seriously threatened, and fisheries is probably the best example of that. When fisheries are over extracted or over exploited, they can sometimes fall into a spiral of unsustainable use. And so it's one of the weird things that non-renewable resources are very much prone to over-exploitation, largely because of the dynamics of a market for the resource for whatever it may be. And I'm going to show you some examples of that, of what we call the tragedy of the commons. And we'll talk about that a little bit more next time. But for the remainder of our time here, I've gone on for more than almost 30 minutes now. I want us to look at different types of goods, and by goods we just mean something that's in demand. And this is more of an economic approach to things, but it makes sense for us to understand what these are, because I want you to, as we look at different examples of renewable and non-renewable resources, I want you to be thinking about how the products from those resources are utilized and how it might affect the natural resource. So you'll see from your screen that I don't know if you can see the whole thing. We have 4 examples of types of goods in orange, and those would be the excludable good, a non-excludable good, and then a rival good and a non-rival good. Okay. So just before we even read through those definitions, an excludable good is just something where there is the possibility that you can control the use of that with something like a price or some sort of legal, some sort of law system or legal system like that retains property rights. So the recognition of property rights and the ability for a legal system to impose sanctions against people who break the rules, that can allow us to produce excludable goods. Okay, so excludable goods are in many ways what we might call protected. They're protected goods. All right, they're excludable in the sense that you can exclude people from utilizing them or exploiting them because you have control over the good in some way through property rights. Non-excludable goods are just the opposite. Anybody can come and get them. They're there for the taking. You really can't regulate them. You can't control people's use of them. So here's some examples. The excludable good is the condition in which access to a good or service by consumers who don't pay for it can be prevented from using it. So, you go to McDonald's, you have to pay for that Big Mac, or if you have, a hole in your radiator in your pickup truck, then, unless you can fix that yourself, you want to have somebody replace your radiator or patch your radiator. So you're going to have to pay somebody to do that, right? So just keep in mind that a good can be something like a Big Mac, a material good, or it can also be a service. So goods and services are both goods here, right? Now, what's another way you can get somebody to fix your car without agreeing with them that you will pay, let's say, $300 to fix your radiator? Well, you can hold a gun to their head, okay, and they might do it. All right, so that's about it. Or perhaps you can, barter is still like a price or like, a payment. So barter is fine, but in a system where everybody wins, okay, if you want to get your radiator fixed and somebody says, well, I can do it, but it's going to be $500. And you say, well, I'm not willing to pay $500 because I know it doesn't take that much time. So you go somewhere and find a guy who says, oh, I can fix it for $300, right? And this is what we'll do. So if you want to pay $300, you're happy, the mechanic's happy, everybody's happy, your radiator's fixed. Okay, duh. All right, so services can be goods as well. A non-excludable good is a good or service in which access by consumers who don't pay for it can't be prevented from using it. Fresh air, public roads, knowledge. Which one of those can you make an exception to right off the bat? Maybe two of them.
Perhaps knowledge.
Okay.
Just like paying with tuition. Like there's some exclusive knowledge.
Okay. When you pay tuition, are you paying for the knowledge?
Maybe
That
not.
can be
I hope not. I hope not. I hope you're paying for access to resources that might, develop your knowledge. Some people actually believe you're paying for your knowledge, but it's not the case. Has the price of knowledge come down in recent years? Like everything else? Yeah.
Yeah, with the internet.
You all have more access to knowledge than any other human ever in the history of the universe. Okay? And I didn't get this to work, but this little computer has probably 100 times more computing power than those that, maybe 1,000 times, I don't know, of the computer systems that put men on the moon 50 years ago. The amount of information that you have access to is almost infinite now. There are very few types of information. There's really not very much information that you don't have free access to these days. I mean, I'm still in amazement. In other words, there is no gatekeeper on information, really. Now if you pay for those resources, you pay for maybe some access to resources in college, maybe you pay for some wisdom or the ability to get some advice and help, but you're not paying for knowledge. You're paying for learning. You're paying for advice and access to lessons that will help you know how to learn. Okay. Anyway, so non-excludable goods. What's another one? How about public roads? In Oklahoma, you ought to have a good example here.
Turnpikes?
Yeah, the turnpikes. Are the turnpikes non-excludable?
No, I mean, you gotta pay to be on them. I just didn't know if they were really considered a public road or not.
Oh yeah, I guess they're public. They're public, but because anybody can drive up, without a pike pass and pay cash to use it. So it's they're excludable. You're not, or at least if you follow the law, you're not supposed to drive through the the red light in the toll booth, right? But you can do it probably, and you probably won't have a huge consequence, I suppose. But don't do that. So, and it's I love turnpikes myself, and any conservationist ought to love turnpikes. In fact, I think what we ought to have is we should make every single road in Oklahoma a turnpike. But of course, that's kind of difficult right now, right? In other words, wouldn't it be cool? Maybe we'll have this someday. Wouldn't it be cool that if only the people who drove around on the roads paid for the construction of the roads? Right? Who pays for the construction of the roads in Stillwater, Oklahoma?
The taxpayer,
Who? What taxpayer?
probably collective of the state.
Yeah, I guess in the city, I'm not really sure, but any road, and I can say this with some confidence, most every road in the United States is going to have a little federal money attached to it. There's always going to be some federal facet of it, but it's going to be coming from state, state taxes, federal transportation funds, maybe local taxes, So there's a variety, but what about that person that can't drive? What about the person that walks everywhere? What about the goofy professor who rides a bicycle everywhere and never, or I guess walks if you ride a bike, unless you're on the sidewalk. But if you're walking, you don't have any really use for a car. Why should you be paying the same amount of taxes that the person who makes their living driving every day, or the company like UPS makes their, they make these profits off of using our roadways, but yet we're the ones paying for the road.
They might inadvertently profit from it, like goods and services being brought to their homes, and maybe a grocery store, public transportation.
So it's really hard to measure, right? It's really hard to measure who needs it and who doesn't, or who should pay and how much they should pay, right?
I did have a question on the fresh air, though.
Mm-hmm.
There's been some proposals for like a carbon tax for industries
Absolutely.
to release large amounts of carbon into the air using it like a sewer system. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, that's an attempt to get the people who are reducing the quality of the resource to not reduce the quality of the resource, or at least have some incentive for them to adjust their what would you call it, their emissions, right? It's not so much paying to repair anything, because you can't really repair fresh air. You can just try to give people incentives not to do it. But yeah, that's one attempt to try to place a price on things that nobody is really responsible for. Okay, I mean all of us are responsible for it. But let me admit somebody here. It's like Warren. Sarah is coming in, so here's Sarah. Welcome, Sarah, wherever you are. There you are, Sarah Warren. So you get the point, excludable and non-excludable. If I put something on Facebook Marketplace, like maybe I have a car that I need to sell, and I put it on Facebook Marketplace, obviously I'm trying to find people who are willing to pay the price for that car that I want. I may have it overpriced, it may be on there forever. But obviously what allows me to charge a price for and sell a car? What allows me to do that? That's kind of a weird question.
I don't know, free market.
When you buy a car, okay, when you buy a vehicle, if you've ever done that, especially with like a vehicle, what processes do you have to go through to actually purchase that from somebody?
You got to get a title swap, get it in your name.
Yeah, you got to transfer title. And what's a title?
Just proof that this belongs to you.
Proof. Well, possession 90% of the law? Well, not when it comes to cars, but yeah, exactly. That title is a legal document that certifies you as the person who has control and has the control over the exclusion of that vehicle. So once that person signs over the property to you, whether it's a title or a deed or something like that, then you have that property. I'm glad you have your face mask on. I wouldn't want to catch anything from you. All right, you can unmute if you like. But anyway, that legal system is what's allowing us to have excludable goods. Without an adequate legal system, without the ability for you to demand, demand without for you have, I can't talk. Say somebody steals your car, right? But you're in an area where the law doesn't, there is no law, or there's no way to enforce the law. The law may exist, but it just may not be enforced because the cops might be corrupt. So legal systems property and exclusion relies on people playing by the rules. And people don't play by the rules everywhere. They only play by the rules where they really have to. Okay? Some places, like in North America, there's an assumption that everybody's playing by the rules. You're going to play by the rules. Well, not everywhere. It's not like that everywhere. So non-exclusion, exclusion. That's enough. Enough on that. Rival goods. You all see that? A rival good is that large enough for you to see? Because I can't see it myself. Is that better? Can you see that? Okay. Well, a rival good and a non-rival good has really nothing to do with price or the ability to keep somebody from using something. It's it's just the nature of the good or service. So a rival good is a good in which use by one prevents simultaneous use by another, or the use of something by one person diminishes the ability of someone else to use it. Can you think of any examples besides, okay, obviously a hammer, two people can't use a hammer at the very same time, right? A parking space. This is always a perfect, or one of the better examples of a rival good. Is a rival good excludable or non-excludable in this sense? Or is a parking space excludable or non-excludable? And you should say yes. Of course. On campus, what are they? Is your parking space on campus excludable?
Well, here in Tulsa, we can just park wherever we want. We don't need to really pay pass. But
Cool.
I have a friend who's in Norman, and when he goes to school, you have to buy a specific pass, and then it only allows you to park in certain spots in the campus.
That's the way it is in Stillwater too. I don't have a parking sticker for my car this year. I figured I wasn't going up to campus enough to really justify it. And after 5 o'clock on the Stillwater campus, you don't need a parking sticker. So if I have to go to my office, I'll go after 5, or I'll ride my bicycle. I'm only a couple miles away from campus. So, I don't really want to pay $158 or whatever it is this year just for a parking sticker. Okay. I'm going to save some money. Certainly don't want a garage, those $300 and $400 things. So a rival parking space on campus is only rival for those people who have the parking sticker, right? But what if you're going to, let's say, I'll give you an example. What if you're going to the Tumbleweed for the calf fry? Oh Lord, I hope you don't. All right, but anyway, if you go to the Tumbleweed for a calf fry, I don't know if the parking's free or not, but it's sort of a race to get the best parking space. Or maybe you're just going to Walmart on a busy day. So the parking spaces are not going to be charged, but so they're non-rival, right? So it's a matter of supply and demand, whatever. Okay, Underwear, good example of a rival good. Generally only one person wears it at a time. Not that there's anything wrong with doing something otherwise. Chewing gum, okay. I understand that. All right, so rival and non-rival, you understand you can take it away from somebody if you're using it. Non-rival, on the other hand, these are the ones that really are interesting and kind of brain teasers. A non-rival good. It doesn't matter how many people utilize it or how many people access it. There is no limit to the number of people who can benefit from this particular good. So things like religion, okay, national defense. That's kind of an interesting one, isn't it? So the United States certainly pours, far, far more wealth into our national defense systems than any other country by far. And what does that do? Well, first of all, it's expensive and everybody, we are paying for it, but even those people who maybe they're not United States taxpayers who are just visiting for a little bit, they're going to be benefiting from our national defense. If they come within our borders, they're still, they're benefiting from that good. No, everybody does. Democracy, another example. Okay, so non-rival and rival goods. I'll probably ask you some questions about, I'll give you some examples and you tell me if they're rival or non-rival or excludable or non-excludable. And, most of the time you can come up with exceptions. You can come up with alternative examples. All right, we're going to move on to, these are more of they're not really comparative. They're just kind of, just other typologies of goods. And they're not mutually exclusive from those first four, okay? So a private goods are those, I stuttered apparently. Private goods are excludable and rival, okay? So excludable and rival, like anything that you purchase that you're going to use at one time. Okay, obviously, lunch, that's you're purchasing it and you're going to use it, and nobody else can do that if you purchase it. Public goods, on the other hand, here I won't scroll past, you can see that. Public good is non-excludable and non-rival. Open access roads, public parks, national defense, like we've talked about. Nobody's contesting over, nobody's at odds over getting more or less of the same thing most of the time. Here's an interesting one, a club good. Club goods, I think, are on the rise. How many of you have like subscription services to all sorts of stuff? You can get a subscription service to shavers and shaving cream now, right? Mm-hmm. I have a friend who has subscription services to so many things that it will boggle your mind. Subscriptions to, let's say, wine purchases, okay? Or subscription, whatever, what I'm talking about. So, but a club good, that's not really a subscription necessarily. A club good is non-rival and excludable. So you have to pay for it, but there's no limit. What? Somebody say something? Okay. It's non-rival and excludable. So you have to pay for it, but there's no limit to the number of people who can use it. And I don't know, like Wi-Fi is maybe an example. Somebody's paying for it, but other people can use it at no additional cost. HBO, right? Any sort of digital music subscription, you all have like Spotify or Apple Music or something like that. So there's, you can, if I was using Spotify for a while there, and it's, $10 a month. Actually, it's like $5, isn't it, for your students? Or maybe, I don't know what it is. But
it's $5 with the EDU.
Is it $5 if you have EDU on your email? Guess what? I have EDU on my email. Anyway, but thing is, if you don't use it, I mean, how many songs should you listen to before you know, say you're paying her $5 or $10 a month? How much time is that worth? For me, I would listen to it maybe a total of a couple hours a week at the most, you know, and that's probably just a waste of money. So club goods. Common goods, these are both rival and non-excludable. And we've reserved those for the very last for a very good reason. They can only be used once, so it's a first come, first served deal, and you can't really prevent anyone from taking them. So these common goods have a limited supply and are essentially free to anyone to take. Common goods. Can you think of any examples?
Oh, she was giving out the mask. They just leave them on a table. Anyone can take them, but you don't want to share them.
True. That's a fantastic example. So, yeah, I mean, if they put the masks out, what are they depending on for people to, just to have those distributed well?
They're probably hoping that people will only take one mask instead of taking 5 or 6.
So what are they depending on if they're hoping?
Conservation.
Okay. Or maybe in terms of the behavior of the consumers. You know, they're probably hoping or assuming that most people are not going to take advantage of the situation. Most people are going to be good citizens and take just what they need, right? And not take everything. And just say, I'm going to go sell these on Facebook Marketplace for 10 cents a piece. Surely they wouldn't do that. Okay, so you know, when it's stuff like that, yeah, it's good. Okay, well, if they would have sold those for like cost or maybe a little below cost, some people wouldn't take them, right? So it makes a lot of sense to just throw them out there for everybody. There's no reason why you can't take one, right? No reason why you shouldn't. So their incentive is to make sure everybody has one, regardless of price, regardless of the greed of some people who might actually take way more than they. What's another product kind of like that? You probably don't know it because they don't sell them very much anymore, but newspapers. In the old days, when you would open a newspaper stand, I mean a newspaper box, you know, on the street, you pay for one, but you could take all of them if you want. You know, nobody's really going to stop you from that. It's just very rude. And but the newspaper is assuming that most people are going to be honest. If they're reading a newspaper, they're probably not crooks. Okay. All right, or probably not terribly dishonest. So, but these are really difficult, especially if you're talking about a natural resource. If there is a profit to be made on common goods, then we've got a situation where we have the potential for overuse, overexploitation, and because a common good is both rival and non-excludable, there is actually a dynamic to the price or to the value. There's maybe not really a price, but there's a dynamic to the value, and as the demand goes up, okay, or as the supply falls, the price is going to create a greater incentive for people to go after it. Okay, so this is the type of good. Common goods are the ones that are most prone, in the sense of non-renewable goods. Those are the ones that are most prone to being depleted. So things like marine fisheries, great example. Marine fisheries, I say marine fisheries, not freshwater fisheries. You know, if you eat catfish or maybe crawfish that's produced in the United States, those are probably going to be produced on fish farms and in aquaculture situations where the person who's putting in the work to raise those things are going to be, you know, making the profit. But if we're talking about marine fisheries where the resource is outside of the boundaries of a state, outside of the boundaries of a legal system, out on the high seas, 200 miles beyond the coast, then you've got a situation where the good or the resource is truly non-excludable and the supply is limited. And so as the resource, as the supply falls in nature, the price is going to rise because the demand is, because the supply is lower. And so that becomes a cyclical problem, what we might call sort of a circular, what do they call that? I'm losing it. It's about time to go here. So anyway, we'll talk more about what we call the tragedy of the commons. The whole tragedy of the commons is the reason it is a tragedy is because even the people who are participating in the overexploitation of a resource, they realize that they're doing it, but they still do it anyway. They realize that they're depleting the resource, and that's just an incentive to do it faster, because if they don't do it faster, somebody else will get it. Okay? So we'll talk about the tragedy of the commons next time, and you all have been very accommodating to a babbling professor in one of his spare bedrooms, and I hope to see you maybe tomorrow. Okay? Y'all have any questions over any of this?
Are you gonna?
Sarah?
So where can we find this? Can we find this on the Canvas for your class?
Yeah, it takes a little while, but it will. I'll get a link later tonight. Probably it takes about 6 or 7 hours. I don't know, this afternoon or so, and I will. I can post the whole thing, and maybe chop up bits of it. I think today we'll just post the whole thing, so you'll get to see this if you want to later, and it will have a transcript, so it will have closed captioning on it, and so anyway, that's your question. Jeffrey, do you have a question?
Yeah, with the sheet you were showing us with the 8 different types of goods, will you upload that to Canvas?
You bet. That's coming very quickly.
Sweet. Thank you.
All right. Y'all have a good day.
Take care.
Stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.